Today, we're going to talk about pre-Islamic Arabia. But before we get into pre-Islamic Arabia, let's just cover a couple of review questions. We will have a quiz on Thursday. So these two questions are to help you prepare for that quiz. It's going to review what we talked about last week. So that first question that I would like to ask, and I'd invite all of you, even though we're meeting over YouTube here, to ask yourself this question and see if you can answer it. But the first question is, who were the Byzantines and Sasanians? And what were relations like between these two groups in late antiquity, or the early 7th and late 6th century? The second question is, what religious movements and traditions shaped the Eastern Mediterranean in late antiquity? So elements of those questions will be on the quiz that we take on Thursday. Other questions will be derived from today's lecture or discussion. So I hope we are able to get out of that. Now let's move on to discussing pre-Islamic Arabia. Now, why I want to discuss pre-Islamic Arabia? Because it can help us answer questions about the advent of Islam. What ideas and cultural elements are shaping early Islam? What questions of morality are being debated in pre-Islamic Arabia? It's important for us to know that this period of history in Arabs' minds, or in Muslims' minds, I should say. I don't want to intermix Muslims and Arabs. They're not the same thing. But in Muslim minds is commonly referred to as Jahliyyah, or the Age of Ignorance. This is a period of time in which people are seen as trapped in sin. They're living sinful lives, generally speaking. They're worshiping false idols and all of those things. And so understanding that lens through which this period is discussed in Islamic terms can help us understand a little bit about what Islam is in its early years, because so much of that history we don't have as complete a historical record as we may like. So the first question to get to here is, who are the Arabs? How long have they been around? Where did they come from? Some of those questions we don't entirely have answers for, or we have answers that may not satisfy everyone. The first mention we have of Arabs in the historical record come from an Assyrian scribe in the 9th century who mentions them on a tablet. So we know that the Arabs are a people by that period of time, by early antiquity. We also know that the term Arabs is used in the Bible on a few occasions. So we know that there's this group that operates on the periphery that are mentioned by these bigger kingdoms, referring to Arab peoples in the historical record. Archaeological and genetic research suggests that the Arab peoples arrive with other Semitic peoples in the region around the 4th millennia BC. So this is a long time, around the year 4000. So they've been in the region for a long time. We don't know exactly where they come from. They are Semitic, I just mentioned. Other Semitic peoples, historically, you may look at the Akkadians as a Semitic people. You can look at the Jews, Hebrews. Hebrew is a Semitic language. In Ethiopia, the Amharic language is Semitic as well. And genetic studies do show that there is some relations, some genetic relationship between these groups. These groups are related. They descend from common language families and common ancestry, as to where they begin to separate. Now, in religious traditions, in the Islamic tradition and in the Jewish tradition, the Arabs are seen to have come out from Abraham, and specifically from his son Ismail, or Ishmael, if we're following the biblical, the English translations, right, of the Bible. Ishmael, of course, is the firstborn of Abraham from Hagar, the servant of Sarah. Of course, Abraham later has Isaac, and then later will marry again after Sarah's death, and will have 6 more sons, who sometimes are also believed to have been the fathers of the Arab peoples. Now, I use that term peoples here because it's important. The Arabs, as we see them, by the time Islam is coming into being, and our look into pre-Islamic era, there's a lot of different Arab peoples, and even the Arabic language is very diverse. It's and cultural is diverse, and religion is diverse throughout, and there's a lot of different Arab tribal groups, family groups, and we know that in Muhammad's lifetime, the Arab peoples are very tribal, meaning blood relationships are among the most important relationship that you can have, and these tightly knit tribal groups that generally don't get very large and often are nomadic are what dominate much of Arab culture during this time. Now, it's important for us to also note that some historians have noted that the term Arab historically may have just been a blanket term for many of these desert nomad peoples, even into the Islamic age, that scholars of the time and writers of the time, when they are referring to the Arabs, they are not referring to people who speak Arabic, but they are referring to people who are living nomadically. They don't live in settled communities. They wander periodically following wet seasons and herding their flocks and traveling from oases to oases throughout the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula and into the Fertile Crescent. We could debate, historians do debate that, but there is some evidence that suggests that that's how the term is used. Because of this nomadic nature, it's typically, if you're traveling around constantly, carrying around a big library full of your traditions and full of your writings is not easily conducive to that lifestyle. And so the writings that we do have from the pre-Islamic era are fairly scant. There's not a whole lot of them. But we do have some, and oftentimes it's written down on rocks. The Sephardic language, which has recently been, I shouldn't say discovered, but has recently been studied intensely by a Jordanian scholar, Ahmed Jalad, who I believe teaches in England, but he might teach in the US. But Dr. Jalad has given us a big window into the beliefs and practices of pre-Islamic Arabians and some of their migratory patterns. And Sephardic was using Greek script and other scripts like Aramaic scripts to write the Arabic language, and much of it's written on rocks throughout the Jordanian deserts. And while much of the Arabs are historically seen as nomadic, it doesn't mean that there haven't been kingdoms and other groups that have emerged and settled down into settled communities. And so we do have some of these. Just for example, historically, the Nabatean civilization. So the Nabateans built Petra, that marvelous city built into the cliffs of southern Jordan that you can see here. You may think Indiana Jones when you see this. If you visit Petra, they often have pictures of Indiana Jones and other things of that. Lesser known but equally impressive is the city of Palmyra, or Tedmur, the ancient city of Palmyra, not the one in New York State today, that was ruled over by Queen Zenobia in the 3rd century CE. And here, just another is an example of what Sephardic script looked like, so what people are writing. And here's an Arabic inscription in Sephardic. Oftentimes, these are odes to themselves. These are prayers that are written on these rocks. Etch a prayer in stone, and it'll make those deities that you're praying to hear your prayer that all the more. And with that being said, I want to go into the topic of religion next, because religion is incredibly important to the Arab world today, and it's really important for us to understand the environment into which Islam is born. I don't think we can properly understand what the tradition said, what Muhammad's, what the message of the Quran is, what the traditional account of Muhammad's life is like, without understanding religion in pre-Islamic Arabia. Again, this is a period of time in which Muslims don't look at this era with a lot of glory, right? The pre-Islamic Arabs are pagans. This is a period in which they are referred to as the Jahliyyah, literally the ignorant. This is the age of ignorance. You can probably look at this in LDS terms. This is a period of apostasy, right? The Arabs are supposed to have descended from the monotheist Abraham. But by the time of the life of Muhammad, Arabs throughout the region are worshiping everything from trees to rocks to the sun to the moon. There are various gods they are worshiping. Many of them, there are idols. And this idolic worship can take many shapes and forms. It's also important for us to understand that religion as we conceive it today is much more of a modern phenomena. We could look at religion in this ancient tradition. And today we talk a lot about belief, and it's important to believe the correct thing, to worship the right God, right? And this is something that will be formalized with the advent of Islam. But in these ancient societies, many of them, especially because they were polytheistic, belief wasn't as important as pleasing the right God, pleasing the right person. So it wasn't so much as if I believed or not, but if I gave sacrifice to all of these different gods, one of them, as long as I'm doing it to one of them that actually exists or one of them that has the power to help me, that's all that matters. And it doesn't matter as much that your acts, not your acts, but your thoughts and beliefs are correct, but simply your behavior and your actions are correct. And that is a shift that will later change with the advent of Islam. And of course, we're having this other shift in other parts of the world as well. And especially in paganism, other things that are important to understand in Islamic paganism is gods were often tribal, meaning your tribe, some ancestor in your tribe was given sustenance underneath X fig tree. And so that fig tree must be a god that saved your family, that saved this great figure of your ancestors. Also in this paganistic belief, when you worship, there isn't a belief in a resurrection. There isn't necessarily a belief in an afterlife as we see it, but spirits exist and your ancestors' spirits exit their body. And so that tribal element is important because you are worshiping not only these various gods, but you're also, having that kind of almost like filial piety that we talk about in Confucianism of, paying the right, doing the proper rites to your ancestors and doing your ancestors proud, like making sure that they can have pride in your actions. Now, all of this talk of paganism, and there's lots of different pagan gods. There's fertility gods and sun gods and war gods and all those, some of the most prominent, and goddesses, right? Gods aren't just men. You have Alet and Shems and El-Uzza and Menet and all of these gods that are believed by the Arabs. And you can see here is a picture of, one of these idols that has been saved. There's not a ton of them that exist today because Muslims look at idolatry amongst the most abhorrent of sins, and so idols are often smashed, but we do have some archaeological remnants of them today. But all this talk about paganism, we can't distract from the fact that monotheism does exist within the Arabian Peninsula during this time. That there are Jewish Arabs at the time, Jewish in the sense of they are religiously Jewish, but they speak Arabic. They live in the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, some of them were the early allies of Muhammad before relations went sour. We could talk about the Banu Qurayza and other groups as well. So in tradition, we know that there's Judaism. We know that Christianity at least has some relevance in parts of the Arabian world. We don't know as much about in Mecca. There's some traditions that state that there is an icon of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child in the Kaaba, which we'll talk about in just a second. So this would be evidence of some kind of Christianity floating around, or at least some knowledge of that Christianity. There's probably a Zoroastrian influence in some of these Persian forms of monotheism that are and dualism that are floating around the Arabian Peninsula as well. And so the Arabian Peninsula becomes kind of this melting pot. And generally speaking, when religion is tribal, this isn't a personal belief, this isn't a personal convert, but kind of you worship with your tribe, you worship with your family, and you don't break with that. It's kind of an unknown rule. You an unwritten rule. You stick with the family, you stick with the tribe. But there is an element of melting pot here. There's also this tradition of a group known as the Hanifs. The Quran mentions the Hanifs. We don't really know who they are, other than the Quran teaches them as kind of, the correct religion before Muhammad. These people who had stayed loyal to the truth about what Abraham taught and had worshipped accordingly. The archaeological evidence doesn't support the existence of Hanifs. We don't really have any other much written or archaeological evidence, but this is mentioned in the Quran, and so we should acknowledge it. And again, the written record is very sparse when we get to the Arabian Peninsula, so it would not be at all shocking if there was a marginal religious group that was not the historical record just doesn't leave much left to discuss. Now, specific to Islam, and again we're talking about pre-Islamic Arabia, the center of the Islamic faith existed prior to Islam. And I guess when I say the center, the most physical center, because the center to Islamic faith, of course, Muslims would say is God, Allah, but as a physical location. And so there's this building that exists in the city in eastern Arabia, in an area of Arabia known as the Hijaz, that goes along the Red Sea coast. And this building is a cube, and it's called the Kaaba, which in Arabic just means the cube. And it's a stone building, just very plain. And historically, in Islamic tradition, this was built by Ishmael and Abraham together. And this was meant to be the center of worship of the true God. Almost like a temple in a sense, right? This is where you pray towards. This is where this space represents like the physical home of God on earth, even if God doesn't necessarily reside in a home, because God is incomprehensible and he's all-knowing, all-powerful, all the things that many monotheistic religions say about God. But over time, the Kaaba, and by the time Muhammad was alive, the Kaaba served as a center of worship for all of the different belief systems that floated around this region of the Hijaz. So all these pagan Arabs had various gods. There's fertility goddesses here, and there's like I mentioned earlier, there's some belief that there's a icon of the Virgin Mary. There's idols to everything that you can think of, and with this robust pagan worship, there develops a robust economic element as well, right? Because if you're going to go worship here, if you're going to go sacrifice, you need something to sacrifice, whether you're burning incense to your gods or whether you are sacrificing animals to your gods. And even in a less savory mind, oftentimes some fertility rites involved, what we basically see as prostitution today. You would pay to have relations with a priestess who would of course bless you with the ability to be fertile. But all of these kind of elements that fluctuate around these temple structures in the ancient world are developing around Mecca. And it's important because Mecca becomes a place of relative peace. While outside of Mecca, you may fight over the right to who has the right to this well, or who has the right to water their to herd their sheep to this oasis. So tribes are going to fight over this. But because all of these different groups come to this center for worship, Mecca becomes a place where you put down your blood feuds. You put down your fights between each other. You lay down your arms so that everybody can worship in peace, even if you're worshiping different gods and worshiping slightly different things. So we have this kind of sanctuary and this pilgrimage to this city, and it becomes the Kaaba in Mecca serves as the economic engine of ancient Meccan society, and protecting this center of economic activity. And it's positioned in a place along trade routes from Syria and the land of Canaan or Palestine, whatever we want to call it, down to the more larger settled communities in the Arabian Peninsula, specifically in Yemen, that exist as well. And so all of this plays to build up Mecca in the late 6th century and early 7th century, during the time of Muhammad's life. And it'll shape Muhammad's life as well. There's also this importance, there's this black meteorite that has fallen from heaven that is believed to have mystical powers, that rests in the Kaaba and is, kind of a proof of, the divine support for the Kaaba that exists. I should say there are some historical records that would suggest that the Kaaba in Mecca is not the only Kaaba in all of Arabia, that there's a series of other ones like this that exist, but this is the only one that survives to modernity. This is obviously the only one that becomes viewed as the center of the Islamic faith, and we don't have conclusive evidence that those other Kaabas existed, but it would also make sense that other centers of pagan worship would have been destroyed in the Islamic conquest. So there's plenty of explanations for why there aren't any other ones, if there once were, left today. But just to have an understanding. Now you can see here in this picture that the Kaaba is covered by a black cloth. It has not always been that case, but today they cover it in this black cloth that's inscribed with Islamic verses of the Quran and decorations. And this is the center of the Islamic faith. This is where Muslims pray towards. This is where you orient yourself 5 times a day, and say prayer. So moving on from religion, so I think I've touched enough, and we'll dig more into the Kaaba, we'll dig more into religion when we start talking about Muhammad and how his message relates to some of these ideas of the Jahliyyah. But we also have to understand culturally what drives and what is probably the most important medium of art form. Now, like much of the ancient world, writing comes later. And the Arabs, being nomads, most of the Arabs being nomads, don't have these great written records. And what is the most important medium is then somebody who can tell your story, who can tell your tribe's story, who can tell of the wonders and the heroes of your tribe, of your family. And these are the poets, who can put into word form these amazing stories that both entertain and educate and teach morality. There's often these moral messages in these poetry. So we could look at this in some semblance of like Homer and his oral tradition before his poems begin to be written down. Poetry becomes so important, and poets are believed to be a blessing in your community. And so when we look at ancient Arabia or pre-Islamic Arabia, poetry looms large. Now there's a group of poems known as the hanged poems. They're called the hanged poems because tradition states that they were hung in the Kaaba. I should also state that tradition also there are also some evidence that suggests that the mu'allakat, or the hanged poems, weren't written until after the advent of Islam, but we don't know that for sure, or that they're inauthentic, right, to what they claim to be. But this tradition looms large, and even Muslims today, Arab Muslims, are proud of the mu'allakat, this story of poetry, and poetry still looms large in the Arab tradition and culture today. These tales of bravery often reinforce something known as the muruwa, which is this code of honor that every man is meant to uphold. Kind of that imbues ideas of bravery, of sacrifice, of service to your community. this is what is imbued in a sense of equity. That's another thing that we do know about lots of these tribal societies that existed on a nomadic level. They were often quite egalitarian. There wasn't a tremendous amount of difference in wealth. The wealthy man had a nicer camel than maybe other members of the tribe and had a nicer tent, but how much nicer can a tent be than the next guy's tent? And so there's relative equality in this society. And we find this in a lot of societies today. The Muruwaf and much of Arab culture focuses around these twin ideas of honor and shame. That actions can either bring honor to your tribe and your family and to those you associate with, or shame, right? If you are willing to die in battle, this is an honor to do, to fight bravely. But if you're a coward and you run away, you bring shame to the family. And shame can be a means for, quote unquote excommunication, leaving you behind, abandoning you. And so this element of honor shame pervades in traditional Arab society and the pre-Islamic Arab society, along with the importance of these poets, because these poets were oftentimes defenders of the tribe. These were men who would get up in Mecca and through their rhetorical gifts were able to insult other tribes. Think of it almost like rap battles where you have two men who are insulting each other. Your mama's so fat, blah 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 blah. And whoever is the most creative brings honor to their tribe as this means of entertainment. I'm going to share this piece from a historian who studies early Islamic or pre-Islamic and early Islamic history, in which she speaks of a poet. She says, whenever a poet emerged in an Arab tribe, the other tribes would come and congratulate it. Feasts would be prepared, and the women would gather together, playing on lutes as people do at weddings. For the poet was a defense to their honor, a protection for their good repute. He immortalized their deeds of glory and published their eternal fame. On three things the tribes congratulated one another: the birth of a boy, the emergence of a poet in their midst, or the foaling of a mare. So you can see the importance here, end quote, I should have said, but you can see the importance of a poet in Islamic society, or in pre-Islamic society, and to a certain extent in post-Islamic society. Poetry still looms large in the Arab world, something to think about. So we've hit on all of these things, but to wrap this up, you guys have been listening to me yap on for probably longer than you want to. I understand, I was a student once, but I'm going to quickly just help understand a few quick things. The politics of 6th century Arabia. One of the things that's important is there is a tension here between settled and nomadic society. One of the things I talked about just a few minutes ago is the ideas of egalitarianism, right? In tribal nomadic societies throughout history, one cannot accumulate too much wealth when you're constantly moving. But when you begin to settle down, some people can begin to become more successful, have more goods, more land, more. And so you begin to have exaggerations between wealth and inequality in societies. And because of this element, there is an element of, the true way of humanity is to be these nomads. It's to go live by this code of the Muruwa. And settled societies, there's something about becoming settled that is inherently corruptible. You can get too greedy. You can want too much money. You're no longer having to defend your possessions and put your life on the line and do these other things that you have to do in a nomadic society. And so there is this tension that exists. And so even when we talk about Muhammad, the tradition is that he's sent to live off with the Bedouin, with those who are nomads, because they are morally superior. And we'll talk about that on Thursday. Other things that are important is tribalism. Your tribe above all else. Tribes never got very big. Typically tribes get around, 200, 250 people, and they begin to split. And Generally speaking, in these tribal societies, you support your tribe above all else, and it comes into that honor-shame dynamic. But also, this element of honor and shame means that your tribe cannot be wronged without responding. And this creates what we know today as blood feuds, what we'd call, maybe we look at the Hatfields and McCoys, whatever we want to call it. But this idea that if somebody is going to insult your honor or kill somebody in your family is the worst, you have to respond blood for blood. And so these tribal feuds could run on for weeks and months and years, and it could lead to this kind of unending warfare between these nomadic tribes. And of course, this is why Mecca becomes important as a place where people have to set down their arms. The other element here is these Arabs exist on the periphery. And because of that, they become the clients of those around them. So oftentimes, in order to make money, you can be a mercenary, a soldier for hire, and so many of these tribes operate in that regard. And so just a couple of the big names that are important to understand here are the Banu Ghassan, sometimes referred to as the Ghassanids, and these were basically the Roman or Byzantine client. These primarily existed in the northern Arabian Peninsula up into Syria, and they would go to war with the Persians or, pay tribute or receive tribute from the Byzantines. And the second one are the Lachmanids or the Banu Lacham, also sometimes referred to as the Nasrids. And these groups generally supported their clients of their empire around them, and it was kind of a fusing of the worlds of the periphery. For example, when the Sasanians wanted to flex their muscle onto these desert lands that didn't seem to have a lot of value, they may do it through the Banu Lachem, or vice versa, the Byzantines with the Ghassanids. But just something to be aware as we talk about, that while the Arabs were on the periphery, they were still connected. They traded with Syria, they traded with Rome, and so the influences of the world around them, they did not live in a vacuum. Sometimes we think of these people as without armor, without modern weapons. That's not the case. The archaeological evidence suggests that they are very much copying some of the methods of their clients from the outside. And that's where we will end. If you have any questions about today's discussion or lecture, please just leave a comment, or you can email me or message me on Canvas. That being said, everybody have a good day.